Hello and welcome to the View with Hasan Ali. Today we turn to the situation in Iran, which analysts are calling the largest uprising in decades. Mere weeks after demonstrators took to the streets to protest economic hardship, there are shocking claims that thousands of protesters have been killed in a brutal security crackdown. Spokespeople for the Iranian government, meanwhile, are coming out with their own counterclaims. They say that the demonstrations were instigated by a foreign hand, and they've blamed terrorists for killing more than 100 police officers. With the government cutting off communications inside the country, it's extremely difficult to verify the scale of the violence. What we do know is that this moment has become one of the most contested and chaotic stories in global news. And to help us make some sense of what's happening, we're joined by the journalist and author Scott Peterson. Scott has made more than 30 visits to Iran, which is 30 more than me at least. And these visits form the backbone of his book, Let the Swords Encircle Me. He currently serves as the Christian Science Monitor's Middle East Bureau Chief and has covered the region for the last 30 years. Hi, Scott. How are you?
Good, Hassan. How are you?
Really good, really good. Scott, I'd like to begin by asking you to give us just a broad overview of the circumstances that led to this current wave of protests.
Well, Iran has been struck by episodic waves of protest again and again, going back even to the 2009, for example, going back to 1999. So every 2 or 3 years, there are cycles. They're often triggered by different things. They're also put down in different ways, ultimately by violence, and they also play themselves out on kind of different timelines. The reason why the protests that we have just been witnessing are so striking is that it was triggered initially by bazaris. These are merchants and others who were basically taken to the streets and sometimes closed their shops to protest the fact that the Iranian currency, the rial, had dropped precipitously. And of course, this is in the context of a really ailing economy, an economy in Iran that has been hit by American sanctions and more recently by European and United Nations snapback sanctions. These are all regarding Iran's nuclear program. So the economy, and then of course you also have a lot of corruption. You also have mismanagement, and those things have of course plagued the Islamic Republic for decades. So all those created this kind of perfect storm that caused the bazaris to begin these protests in quite a small, measured manner. But as with previous economic protests, they began to snowball. They began to become, about a much larger set of grievances, and ultimately kind of anti-Islamic Republic and anti the leadership, and really you've got all kinds of then people coming to the streets to air their grievances and to try and strike and do what they can to send this message to the leaders of the regime. So it has been, so in this instance, we have this beginning to take place. And you are absolutely right to point to what are two quite distinct narratives that are emerging. One, we have the protesters who note the severity of the crackdown. I mean, we have Iranian officials speaking about a death toll over 3,000, like 3,100. Which in the space mostly of 2 days, there were several hundred deaths that occurred in the first week or 10 days of these protests. But it was literally the 8th and the 9th of January when things really, really rocketed up. Now, the protesters attribute that to the fact that more and more people came out on the streets. They were much bolder, and that the security forces cracked down with absolute lethal force. And again, so many of the previous protests have gone on for weeks or even months, and it's been kind of a slow burn of protest followed by a slow burn of crackdown. So what we have never seen is in the space of 2 days, somewhere like 3,000 people dead. Human rights organizations are naming 3,900 fatalities, but then there are also estimates that can be 3, 4, or even 5 times that number. And I don't think we know yet what the actual what the number is, but what we do know is that this has absolutely rocked the Islamic Republic in ways that it hasn't before. And these particular protests, by the way, we have the counter narrative, which is now becoming much clearer on the part of the on the part of the Islamic Republic, its leadership says that these acceptable, peaceful protests by the Bazaris were hijacked basically by Israeli agents, by Americans, and others. Obviously, you had President Trump saying, "We are with you, keep protesting," but you also had Israeli officials basically say, "We've had Mossad agents on the ground; they're right there marching alongside you," and everything else. So this has been a very convenient kind of off ramp for the Islamic Republic to say that, well, all the violence is the real violence and killings has been at the hands of these agents, and also to say that really this had nothing to do with us. And you're right to note that more than 100 of the security forces have also been killed. But it's really now a question of narratives and what's what's emerging. But ultimately, we still have a complete internet blackout and very difficult for real information to come out.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you give us some kind of breakdown of Iranian society? I mean, it's probably difficult to do in a systematic way, but do we know, for instance, what percentage of the population can be classed as loyalists? What percentage can be classed as hostile to the status quo? Do we have any idea?
There have been working hypotheses, and you're right. I mean, I've been watching Iran for more than 30 years. I've actually made 45 visits. I need to update that factoid. But I've made 45 visits. I haven't gotten a visa for the last 4 or 5 years for a number of reasons. But I think they probably just got to the final chapter of my book. But anyway, what we have always noted or kind of assumed was that there would be a 15 to 20% of the population who were quite kind of hardcore true believers in the Islamic Republic. Now that figure changes according to what happens, the nature of what happens. That's not, they're basically like the Islamic Republic and the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, right or wrong, like, we believe in everything he says because he's our religious leader and because he knows what is the correct response to all these things. And if he says there are Mossad and American infiltrators who have hijacked these protests and have conducted all these deaths, then in fact, that's certainly what's happened. So you have that percentage of true believers, but you also have what is very clear and what has become clear in every single round of protests going back literally 2 decades, that a greater number of Iranians are not in favor or supportive of this regime. And therefore all kinds of reasons, many reasons that is the case. So the economic reasons and there are others. Remarkably, there was a moment of kind of national coalescence, which took place in the aftermath of the Israeli and then the American bombing that took place for 12 days in the June conflict. And that was a really surprising moment, I think. And, for Iranians themselves who thought, wow, okay, they looked and they're like, wow, the things that the supreme leader has been telling us, all of these years, that it's the Americans and the Israelis who really have it in for us. Here's the proof. Look, they're actually bombing us. And that kind of lent itself to an increase of nationalism. And I interviewed a number of people, in fact, who don't have, don't give the benefit of the doubt to the Islamic Republic at all. I mean, they're ones who've been protesting in the past and things. And yet they said, wow, all right, these people are able to secure us. They have a new respect for the messages that were coming out. And that was a real surprise. I mean, I think that has gone now, absolutely dissipated. But that's just the way Iranian politics have, kind of fluctuated over, recent months, certainly, but also over recent years. But I think, the true believers know that they're outnumbered, but they also know they're not going anywhere. No one's getting on a plane to Moscow to fly away. So they holding on is critical.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just the reason I asked that question is because you will have seen that there was also like a sort of a counter demonstration movement, right? So there were the protests, and then there were the counter protests, which were instigated by the government. The government would like you to believe, their spokespeople would like you to believe that somewhere in the region of 2.5 to 3 million people turned up to those protests, those counter protests. Probably not, I would hazard to say. However, they were sizable, just looking at them. So it's just hard for me as someone who isn't an expert to really understand what the breakdown is in Iranian society. And you seem to say, you're suggesting that it's about 20%, 15 to 20% who are hardcore believers, and then the others are,
and
um,
perhaps even less. I mean, keep in mind, this is a country of more than 90 million people. So,
right.
to pull out, several 100,000, and that's the figure that I've seen for the true numbers of people who went out. Of course, and interestingly enough, the Islamic Republic is going to, try and enhance and make those numbers look as big as possible. And my understanding from people who watch closely is that some of the footage that state television was showing of the counter marches, the counter protest marches, which were sizable, definitely, hundreds of thousands of people, no question about it. And I mean, the regime, the translation for nizam, which basically
Nizam.
means establishment or system. So
Yeah.
well, we can use regime as well, but they have also apparently, while putting forward like kind of state television, they filtered in images of, for example, the huge funeral rallies for Qasem Soleimani, who the commander of the Quds Force, who Donald Trump ordered assassinated in Baghdad back in 2000, and those were huge national events. So of course, if you're kind of feathering in imagery like that, it looks, the numbers look a lot larger. What I will say is that figures that we do have actually confirmed, official figures, if you go back to the 2009 protests, you remember when President Ahmadinejad basically won, quote unquote, and so many Iranians said, wait a minute, where's my vote? Like, there's no chance that he won. And we understand that obviously he didn't win that election legitimately. On the third day of protests, 3 million people took to the streets in Tehran alone. That is the figure that has come from the mayor's office, etc. In recent decades, we have never seen more than that for any single event at all, probably not even for Soleimani's funeral. And they were against this election being stolen from them. So, of course, they're going to say 2 to 3 million people. I don't think there's the possibility that 2 to 3 million people, certainly not in Tehran, were there. Maybe if you add it up from all the cities around. And, one thing that they can do is, of course, they can mobilize all kinds of people. And keep in mind, it doesn't even take that many. I mean, if you have 10,000 people who are willing to sacrifice their lives, as the Revolutionary Guard are meant to have, signed on to, or the voluntary, kind of ideological Basij militia, they have far more than 10,000 people to call upon who can do that. And with that number of people who are behind you, of course, you can achieve a lot, especially if you have the advantage in the weapons and everything else. So, I wouldn't see those counter marches and the scale of those as indicating that like 80% of the country is behind the government, because they aren't.
Just as an aside, going back to 2009 and the election that you talk about, so what is the evidence that Ahmadinejad did not win? Because I was much younger at the time, but I remember this sort of claim and counterclaim thing happening then too. And because I'm not absolutely clear on it, I wanted just as an aside to ask you what the evidence is for that.
I have an entire chapter of my book which details and goes into all of the different aspects. I mean, of course, there are multiple layers, sets of and this is everything from numbers that had originally, that had been posted at local electoral locations, right, which are then meant to be called into the national headquarters, and those numbers changing from what they had been at the local level. By the time they actually get into the national figures, they're adjusted. And that was just one of many, many different irregularities that took place during that. And we have, people saying that they'd been told to stuff ballots, and just, evidence emerged over time. My book came out the next year after that election. So we had a lot, when the Green Movement finally, so that election was in June 2009, and the Green Movement protests were finally stamped out for good the following February. So when I talk about and that protest was huge and, kind of nationwide, but carried on for more than half a year, which is extraordinary, right? By the time it was finally, finally stamped down. Now, remarkably, and this has been the case in a lot of protests in Iran, there were only, I think, a total of something like 500 people who were killed in all of those months of quite severe crackdown, which is, and then up until this last, week or two, the previous highest, toll of protests were economic protests from 2019, and that figure was 1,500 that that Reuters used, and no one has any reason to to doubt that. But that was over the entire set of protests at that time. I mean, even the Masa Amini ones, which everybody remembers, from 2002, just nowhere near the death tolls, which is why this very high death toll in such a compressed amount of time has analysts saying, well, this clearly shows that the regime felt desperate and we're clinging on. And obviously part of their narrative is that there were also outside hands that were assisting as well.
So you've already spoken about previous protests, and you compared them in terms of death tolls. But I was wondering, are there sort of ideological similarities or continuity between the different protests? Is this a continuation of the same movements, or is it something unique?
I think so. That's a great question. And, and every single one of these protests, really does have kind of different triggers. It starts in a different way. Obviously, the Masa Amini, woman life freedom protests, which were very substantial and really shook the government and the regime and the security forces. They were triggered by the death of this young woman, at the hands of the morality police, the so-called morality police, for, not wearing enough hair. And that just triggered a landslide. And so there's a social issue that triggered much larger, protests where people are burning Khamenei's, picture and shouting death to the dictator and, and all of that. The 2009 protest triggered by a stolen election. The 2019 protest, an economic one that was about, fuel subsidies being removed and therefore the price of that, going higher. And then this one that, here triggered by the Bazaris, who normally are, kind of one of the foundations. And that's one thing that should concern the religious authorities and the Islamic Republic is, that these were Bazaris who have traditionally formed part of the foundation of the Islamic Revolution. So if they're complaining, then that's sign of a deeper problem. So each of these has a different trigger, but they all then start with a similar trajectory, because as they gain steam, people have all sorts of complaints, and then they will go and air them, in the best way that they can do it. Although they know that, so far it hasn't changed things in a fundamental way. Like, in other words, it's not going to cause the government to completely change its economic policy or anything like that. But they do have critical influences. Like, for example, the Masa Amini protests, woman life freedom. After those protests were done and they were stamped out, with the, quite brutally. But once they were done, the enforcement of some of those social, like wearing hijab, wearing hair cover, covering your hair, and even, like having bare arms and things like this, enforcement just kind of disappeared. And
they lost that battle, essentially.
They lost that battle, but they recognized that they'd lost it. So even though you have some hardliners, in Parliament and elsewhere saying, we've got to go in and reinforce this because this is the backbone of the Islamic Republic, the actual decision makers in the Islamic Republic understand that safety valve was necessary, because what we don't want is for this kind of thing to gain so much steam that we can't control it, or it gets beyond our ability to crack down.
Of course. Now, I am going to ask you your opinion on this. Obviously, it's impossible to verify one way or another. You've mentioned already that the Iranian government has come up with a number. Their own damage assessment says that 3,117, I think the number is, people died. In my experience, when things like this happen, the government has an incentive to downplay the death toll. Do you believe that, is it safe to assume that this figure is a conservative estimate? Let me put it that way.
Absolutely safe to consider that a conservative estimate. Now, keep in mind, they're trying to achieve two things which don't actually add up, right? So they're trying to basically, not make the death toll so high that the security forces, who so many Iranians blame for this, like could have killed this many thousands of people. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing in just the space of 2 days, plus several others. On the other hand, they have not assumed responsibility officially for a single death of a single citizen of Iran in the course of this. And for example, if you look at that number, they put forward 3,117, and they say that like 2,400 something are 70 or something are citizen martyrs, and then they include the 100 plus security forces. I think it's 147 or so. But there are 690 people whose status is not described by the Islamic Republic. So those are in the official figures. So, of course, they can't say that 12,000 people were killed, because like, who killed all of them? I mean, as many Mossad or American agents as there may or may not have been on the ground, kind of helping to fuel these protests. I mean, every Iranian knows that like those protests, stemmed from issues between Iranians and their leadership and the Islamic Republic. And that is where also, the bulk of the numbers and everything else, people weren't coming out because Mossad said, you must go, right? And people did come out. No, of course not. Exactly. No. So for them, I mean, clearly many of these people have been killed by the security forces. And in fact, there've been videos posted also even on state media that purported to show that these were, kind of agent, provocateurs, but then later were taken down because, of course, it turned out to be, security forces, being brutal to people.
But the initial protests, that were instigated essentially by the Bazaris, as you say, they followed the collapse of the Iranian rial, right? And what the Iranian government has very consistently said is that this was due to U.S. manipulation. And do you think that is a reasonable claim? Like, I mean, do you think that's true?
Well, I mean, so the economy is definitely in a worse situation than it would have been, due to sanctions. And the Americans have definitely been, pushing sanctions and everything else. And of course, that's helped pave the way for corruption, which is a very Iranian thing on this one. There's some really extraordinary schemes that have been underway, kind of corrupt schemes that have helped to hollow out this whole structure. And there have been descriptions of it that I've that I've seen, and that but these are Iranian things. Now, in some instances, the fact that the sanctions have enabled the Revolutionary Guard to take for itself a larger chunk, control a larger part of the economy, and so all kinds of smuggling and this and that, but also the fact that there's a multi-tiered exchange system obviously is ripe for abuse, which is also one of the things that's happened. So, I mean, yeah, the Americans created conditions in which the economy would be really not very good. But even aside from that.
But I mean, that is sort of, insidious, right? In a way, I mean, in the sense that, like they would like to, I mean, the Americans, I think it's fair to say, if we're being honest about this, would like to create conditions for this sort of unrest on the streets of Tehran, right? Or Mashhad. Like, I mean, that seems self-evident to me, right?
So they definitely, this is where it leads, especially after all of these years. I mean, keep in mind one thing about this, actually, and this is something I think that's really only emerged in these latest protests. So the Israelis have every interest, as they have demonstrated, repeatedly and said and everything else, to like basically, I think their preference would be for Iran to become a failed state. So in other words, crushed, useless, hopeless, therefore unthreatening, and no longer in charge of its kind of axis of resistance regional allies. I think the Americans, and here I'm actually speaking specifically about the Trump administration, they see the possibility of a country, if it remains intact, as being something that's producing oil, something we can do business with, et cetera. So obviously they're not at all in favor of the current leadership, but I think failed state status, I think if they could avoid that, they would do it. And those, so in other words, but again,
but historically historically, Scott, they've not done it. Is why I'm saying this, right? I mean, like when we talk about failed, and I'm not gainsaying what you're saying. I'm just saying failed state status is essentially what has happened to every country in the Middle East where the U.S. has intervened, from Libya to Syria to Iraq,
of course, Iraq,
and they've
Afghanistan.
all. I mean, these places have all failed, right? And if the best wisdom is what's happened in the past, if that is what's going to give you the best lessons to predict what's happening in the future. I mean, I'm just saying this is their track record, right? The Americans, and I'm not saying this as like some kind of like lefty sort of anti-imperialist, which, I mean, I'm just saying this is what it seems like, I mean, this is the track record.
No, that's right. No, the track record's, terrible. But I mean, keep in mind that in many of those cases, it wasn't just a question of like removing a leader. It was like full occupation. I mean, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Americans were just so out of their depth in these places that there was no chance of pulling it together. And I think, but the bottom line is that, this causes a headache for the government of Iran. Iran, continues, from the view of Washington and from Tel Aviv to, threaten, with determination and with ability. I mean, its missile force is still very, very strong. I mean, I'm sure you noticed in the final 12-day war, Iran's missile penetration rate was higher, and its destructive rate of each of those missiles was much greater than in the early stages. And the Iranians themselves have made clear that, like that, we kind of, we're careful with our response in June, and we're not going to be careful again. I mean, they've been very explicit about that.
Well, so let's move on to that, and let's do it this way. Let me read to you a part of an op-ed published in the Wall Street Journal by Sayed Abbas Araghchi, who's the current Iranian foreign minister. The reason I want to run this by you is I think it gives us a good window or a good indication of the Iranian government's preoccupations at the moment, both in terms of what they say and what they don't say. So, and I quote, what Araghchi writes in the journal is, unlike the restraint Iran showed in June 2025, our powerful armed forces have no qualms about firing back with everything we have if we come under renewed attack. An all-out confrontation will certainly be ferocious and drag on far, far longer than the fantasy timelines that Israel and its proxies are trying to peddle to the White House. Very interesting to me. This raises a couple of questions. The first question is, well, it seems from this that the Iranians are still braced for U.S. involvement, some kind of strike.
Definitely expectations. Absolutely.
How likely do you think that is?
I think it's probably fairly likely. The Americans are moving. Military forces into better position. The Israelis, reports were in the course of these protests that the Israelis and the Arabs were both, for different reasons, Arab nations, mostly Gulf states, were basically telling the White House, please don't do anything, like militarily, because, Trump made it very clear that if protesters were killed, then he would, hit them very hard, and, made this threat multiple times. So, well, having just taken out, Maduro from Caracas, those threats carried a little more weight than they probably would have the week earlier. So, so in other words, but the Israelis, obviously, Gulf Arab states are not interested in a conflict that potentially is going to spill over and affect them, because they're right there, and they don't want, as Qatar found, to be kind of in Iranian crosshairs. At the same time, the Israelis are still, have a very depleted air defense system, especially this THAAD missile, which is most effective against the Iranian missiles, the hypersonic ones and the most powerful ones. But those THAAD systems they're American, and they're supremely expensive, and they take a lot of time to make. So the Israelis are feeling a bit vulnerable. And of course, when these decisions were being made, the Americans didn't even actually have a aircraft carrier group in the Middle East anyway. There were two in the Caribbean, and then they had to bring one over from the Far East. So in other words, all the pieces kind of weren't into position, but, Iran has made clear that it's, it will bite back. I mean, this is, what we heard from Araghchi there is is trying to basically reestablish some degree of deterrence. In other words, if you touch us again, you will burn much harder than last time.
Yeah. And then the second thing that I found really interesting about this is this idea of fantasy timelines. This is one of the lines that's in there. Fantasy timelines. Now, he seems to be implying that the Trump administration is being led to believe that the Iranian power structure is like a push away from collapse, and that this is faulty information. I mean, is this true? I mean, it certainly seems that Trump in the beginning was just ready to, go in and, finish the job. I mean, he thought he was just going to completely revolutionize the country with one fell swoop, and then come back triumphant. And then this idea seems to have backed away from this idea.
I think because he understood that actually it wasn't going to happen quite that way. Because there's obviously there are degrees of resilience, that are going on. And I mean, by the way, this is the parlor game that American presidents have played since, Jimmy Carter in 1979. Like, how fragile is this regime? And, no one's ever taken, and kind of how much military pressure. I mean, there's no question that if the Americans military decides they want to remove the regime, they can do it. I mean, there's no question about that. But who has a game plan for the day after? Is that actually really what they want? Because like I mentioned, if the American calculation is if we keep this place intact, then, so that, and I mean, people are talking about maybe the supreme leader isn't there, but the Revolutionary Guard is there. I don't know. There's so many permutations. And that's why this is so complicated. And obviously what Aragji is trying to do is to dissuade, and deter both the United States and Israel. But on the other hand, and also pointing, he's also pointing without specifically saying it, that, regime change efforts in the past in this region have utterly failed. They've all taken much longer timelines, and aside from literally this one-day operation in Caracas, which again has left us in Venezuela, uncertain about where things are going to go in the future. Aside from that, things just take longer. I mean, look at, Vladimir Putin thought his invasion of Ukraine was going to be over in 3 days. And here we are, entering the 5th year of that war next month, which is crazy. And no end in sight, by the way. So that's how these things normally go. And I think Trump probably recognized that and for the moment has stayed his hand. But there, who knows what decision he'll make? Who knows what circumstances there will be? And of course, a number of wild cards on the Iranian side too. How long will the supreme leader still be the supreme leader? He's 86 years old, and imagine the pressures he feels every day. That can't be extending his life. So, who knows?
Right, absolutely. Now, Aragji says, the last part of what Aragji says, which is interesting to me, and we've already discussed this in some detail, is the allegation of the foreign hand. In other words, the Israeli involvement, and perhaps the U.S. involvement. Now, I think it's worth sort of looking at the evidence, so it doesn't seem like we're just trading in conspiracy theories, right? So this is the evidence. Mossad put out a Farsi tweet, as you know, in which they said, "The time has come, we are with you, not only from afar, we are with you in the field as well." So that's one part of it. Mike Pompeo put out a tweet saying, "Happy New Year to every Iranian on the streets and to every Mossad agent walking beside them." And then a reporter on Channel 14, which is a right-wing Israeli TV station aligned with Benjamin Netanyahu, suggested that foreign actors were arming these protests. To what extent do you think Mossad is involved or was involved in these protests?
I think they're absolutely involved. I mean, let's keep in mind that there's, it wasn't by accident that Israel managed to knock out the top military leadership and other key actors in their first strike back in June. They had incredibly good intelligence. Right? Yeah. And then, just months earlier, they'd killed the leader of Hamas, with a specific drone attack in Tehran, no less, going in the specific room where this guy was in some kind of a safe, meant to be a safe place. It was run by the Revolutionary Guard, and a secure location, everything else, and somebody was wise enough to do it. I mean, I think, I don't know that we should ever underestimate the amount of infiltration of Iran that there is by Mossad and by Israeli agents. And I can say that going back to, like, I mean, for me, this became very, very clear when, when kind of the guy who has always been credited with, like, with Iran's nuclear weapons program work, Fakhrizadeh, going back, like, up until 2003, at least. I mean, they appeared to have had a weapons program, and the Israelis took him out on his way to his, like, kind of weekend house up in the mountains, using a satellite operated gun that had been brought in by pieces and like assembled to be on top of, like, a vehicle. Like, it was so the movies, and they did it. But of course, you never could have done that with, and this is a guy who's going to be one of the most well-protected members of the regime. I mean, so in other words, they've demonstrated repeatedly, and of course, the same thing with going after nuclear scientists in the 2007, 8, 9, killing those people. Those are people who were killed by people working on behalf of Mossad, no question about it. So I don't think we can underestimate the level of, and also Iran, if you've been there, is actually quite an open place. So despite the fact that it's, like, securitized, when you're there, people live their lives. People are, it's not like kind of North Korea where, like, if you put your head out the door, everybody knows it, right? I mean, this is a place that's fully alive, and therefore also, and of course, you've got no shortage, if you're Mossad, you've got no shortage of people who will happily do things probably for free for you if they're going to undermine the regime. But if you're paying them, like, you've got legions of people on your side. So, I mean, do Iranians like the Israelis? No. But do they, would some of them see that as a tool to, cause harm to the thing that they think is doing harm to them, which is the Islamic Republic? Definitely. So the point is that they have real live, and
yet you mentioned right at the top, Scott, that the one thing that seemed to galvanize or unite the society in Iran was when the Israelis attacked, right?
Correct.
So,
sure.
So,
absolutely. Because
and just in my experience, these fissures tend to close up when there is an outside attack. I mean, I can give you an example of Pakistan, this was a country that was really, really reeling from the military's sort of treatment of Imran Khan, but then India came and attacked, and it just closed that chasm. So, that tends to happen.
A perfect analogy. Exactly. Because people love their country.
That's right. Absolutely.
Regardless of who's in charge.
Yeah. So, you mentioned a couple of moments earlier that of course that even without a revolution, Iran is poised for a change at the top, right? I mean, the Ayatollah is, as you say, 86 years old. He's increasingly frail. He can't go on forever. What is your sense of the succession planning in Tehran?
Well, it's been underway for months already, and there are obviously a number of candidates that are possible. The Constitution also allows for a kind of a triumvirate of, like a 3-member panel to rule, before there's another supreme leader chosen. That's also a possibility. I think, everything is going to depend on when that happens. I mean, it's obviously inevitable, right? So we're not like, like putting epoxy on anything by discussing it, because in Iran, they obviously are having to make these decisions and figure out the way to do it. But everything will depend on how it happens and when it happens. Is it going to happen in the course of, of a similar next episode of protests? Is it going to happen, under the shadow of an American or an Israeli, military strike? Is it going to happen in a way where, the supreme leader actually announces that this is what should happen, right? Thereby obligating his followers to kind of pursue that path in the interest of ensuring it. I mean, remember, his mindset of the supreme leader Khamenei is the same as it was at the very beginning of the revolution in 1979, when Ruhollah Khomeini, the founder of the revolution, said, the survival of this Islamic Republic is more important than prayers. It's more important than fasting. It's more important than going to Mecca, on the Hajj. So so the whole point is the survival of that. And of course, that's imbibed. That's, part of the mother's milk of the security forces and everything else. Their whole purpose is to make sure that this Nizam survives.
And then some have sort of speculated, some experts have speculated or predicted that actually in the post-Khamenei order, the clerics might not have as much influence, that the regular armed forces and the IRG will have more of a role in the governance of the country. Do you think there's something in that?
I think that's almost inevitable. Absolutely. I think the IRGC, Revolutionary Guard, are going to, they will almost certainly, because they have the most effective structures, despite the corruption, partly because of the corruption and everything else. They have the most capable structure. There's also obviously bureaucratic deep state and that kind of stuff, but it's, the Revolutionary Guard. And of course, they're only one part of the equation. There are other, kind of power centers and things which move around and, have more or less say depending on what day it is or what the circumstances are. But the Revolutionary Guard, are obviously a level of committed, ideologically committed individuals who also have their fingers on every single security lever, in the government and that the regime can bring to bear. So not only for the internal stuff, but also dealing with all the allies from Hezbollah to the Houthis in Yemen and, and all of that. So, and those are the things that of course have been used as the tools of deterrence by a country that since the revolution in 1979 has been up against much stronger enemies, certainly in the United States and elsewhere, and they've always had to deploy these asymmetric means. And so that's their, and that was very, very effective right up until the 7th of October, 2023, when Hamas attacked the Israelis. And then that began a chain of events that has now really changed the region.
Scott, just as we close this show, just a couple of thoughts. This current wave of protests in Iran, for me, it's been among the most challenging of my journalistic career, which is nowhere near as distinguished as yours. And I mean that in terms of how difficult it has been to find out what's actually happening. And it just, what this has crystallized for me is that there seems to have been this gradual erosion of trust in legacy media. The Global South has always been skeptical of Western media. But increasingly, it seems to me that the populations of the Global North, where these news organizations sort of live, they're tending to consume the news they're given more skeptically. You'll see that someone like Professor Morandi will have, when he comes on one of these podcasts on YouTube, will have like far more people viewing him than will be watching CNN, sort of, for instance. You look at
which is very interesting considering his position in 2009. He was one of the great evangelizers of that election, but so
the interesting thing for me is, clearly there have been some blunders, right? There have been some media blunders, and we both work in this industry. The WMD episode was particularly egregious as far as this is concerned.
Of course,
I do think the reporting around the Gaza crisis has been, has been really, really poor. Has left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Even in these societies, where places like CNN and have major presences, and I do sort of, it has had this effect where now it's like if CNN or my former employer CBS tell you that there are large-scale protests in Iran and 6, 7, 8,000 people have died. There are lots of people in the States who would be like, "We just don't believe you." Have you come across this phenomenon?
Well, all we can do, for those of us who believe in the facts and peddle in facts, which is what we journalists do, relative to politicians and others, particular politicians who are particularly good at lying. The Washington Post, by the way, did note and actually kept count of the number of lies, and that was how they termed it, the number of like actual deliberate lies, well, deliberate or not, but like lies that were stated by President Trump during his first term, like when that term ended, and they counted like literally every single day, and they just kept it count like through the whole thing. It was more than 30,000. Now, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when US presidents, when they spoke, they were so careful to adhere to the truth that basically if they said something that sounded particularly, slightly outlandish, or, that in theory you should be able to trust them because it would have already been vetted by their people and their own sense of what should be right? No, so now,
the problem there is they'll probably not say anything at all. But
precisely. That's precisely right. Yeah, exactly. But the point is that when you've got someone who's on television 24 hours a day and puts out 30,000 demonstrable lies, and that's just one place, one source, and then of course all this stuff being like built upon by social media and everything else. I mean, it is shocking what can happen to some of the propaganda in these stories. I mean, we've seen it. I've been to Ukraine a dozen times in the course of this current conflict. And I mean, what the Russians have to say about what's going on in Ukraine is like, it's extraordinary. Like, just, it's extraordinary. And you're like, now who could really actually believe that? And I mean, never mind what's going on in the States at the moment, Minneapolis and everything else about what,
Minneapolis. Yeah.
So I get it that people are, but the problem is that instead of thinking, the mainstream media, which like, I mean, at least you have a checks and balances in the newspaper that I work in and the New York Times, by and large and elsewhere. And you're right to point out those weaknesses in coverage with Gaza or not. We actually have had a correspondent writing for us from Gaza throughout this conflict, which has really, really given us a great concept and idea about what is going on and the suffering that people are going through there. So, but we aren't allowed in. We as foreign journalists aren't allowed in. So we've had to rely on the very strong shoulders of those Palestinian journalists who've told us the whole thing. Anyway, no, it's actually an issue. And I mean, the best we can do is be accurate, be checkable, and reflect the reporting that we are doing the best that we can. It's very difficult when you've got a internet blackout going on, because obviously.
So that would be my second.
Getting back to the Iranian question. So obviously I have, quite good sources in Iran and a lot of different places. But if I were just coming at this fresh, didn't know how to do it, didn't know anything about Iran, I mean, who knows how you'd be able to couch it? I mean, and I think it's too big a lift for a lot of news organizations anyway, if they don't already have a track record in these, in these places. And, in newspapers coverage, I mean, all the papers, the main American newspapers that have been also covering Iran have really good people who have been working for decades on Iran, as I have. Yeah. So I, their sources, they're pretty good and they're pretty reliable. But then again, remember that the actual story is kind of also all over the map. There's not like a single trajectory of this or a single trajectory of that. There are just so many, kind of nuances and things like that. And I think the best we can do is reflect those the best they can be. But no one's going to be 100%, and even if you're inside the country, you've got a different bubble to deal with, I mean, I was just thinking today as I'm pulling together my next story on Iran, the fact that I'm outside means I don't have to think about, what if I write this? What if I write that? Like, I'm just writing what I can find, but I have access to so much more. If I were actually in Iran right now, I'd be able to reflect the views of those handful of people who I could see. But beyond that, it's very difficult to kind of start weighing stuff up, sometimes even easier from outside. But you do need to get voices, obviously, that can point in the right direction. So it's a challenge. Good question.
Yeah. Just wanted to get your views on how much of how knowable the truth actually is in a situation like this for people like you and me who are not there, on the ground. I mean, I just thought that was worth asking.
That's right. That's right. And so that's why it requires, I think the best we can do is to get people who are very, very familiar with Iran. Like I say, I haven't been back for several years, so I missed certain crucial moments. Like, for example, the place looks different in terms of hijab and, kind of street music and things like this, which never existed, before I got my last visa. But now, have become much more regular, much more routine. Now, will that change or not? I want to be there. I want to feel it. I want to taste it. Like I didn't, the last visa I was meant to get, literally, I asked for it on the 6th of January back in December. Well, obviously these protests made that impossible. And then the previous visa that was looking very promising was just before the Israelis struck. And right when they were about to say, yes, Mr. Peterson, you're welcome, the Israelis hit. Well, obviously they're not going to, give a visa to an American journalist, no matter how well they know him or not, like when they're actually under fire. So I haven't been to see myself, but, I've obviously been paying very close attention. I have great people, like who do have also direct contact with people inside, and you just have to collate the best you can.
Of course. We will leave a link to your reporting underneath the podcast. And I just want to close out then with a final question. If you could assess the health of the current dispensation in Iran, what would you say? How precarious is it? Is this an existential threat, this current wave of protests?
This current wave of protests, no. But every wave of protests erodes further the level of trust. And I don't think we can underestimate how this very high death toll, regardless of who they blame it on, and, like in such a compressed amount of time, obviously has told analysts, and I think many, many Iranians, that these guys are desperate. When I say these guys, I'm talking about the Islamic Republic itself, because unlike previous protests, there's very little right now that they can give people. So, like in other words, okay, these were economic protests. So President Pezeshkian comes up with this plan to give $7 per month to each household, and somehow that's going to kind of pave it over. Obviously, people on the streets are like, that's a total joke. That's nothing. It's not going to make a difference. And anyway, the government can't afford it. So the economic problem is still chronic. It's still bad. It's not being solved. And there doesn't seem to be much that's being done to actually fix it. And, they already have given, after the Masa Amini protests, kind of less enforcement of the hijab and that sort of thing, so there are fewer things that they can give to make people happy with their circumstances, and they're just not. And that's what they're coping with. And so, I think the trajectory is going down and not up. When, how, who knows? And there's so many variables at play, but it's, it's not getting better. That's for sure.
Understood. Scott Peterson, thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you, Hasan.